this was really just going to take everyone through just some of the highlights around the revised EYFS and the updated development matters. So let's just go straight in then, I think. So I've just highlighted 4 of the key changes to the EYFS that I think it's worth bearing in mind. That's not an exhaustive list of the changes, but it's just some of the eye-catching ones to me. So change 1 was around the early learning goals, and the updated EYFS has made an effort to make those early learning goals more straightforwardly written and therefore simpler to assess. And the draft version of those early learning goals was road tested a couple of years back and independently researched by the EEF in about 25 schools. And it's heartening that teachers did say that they found those new goals easier to assess, because that then freed up time for them to use in more productive ways. There's no more exceeding level. And again, that's really mostly about reducing workload. So when we had the statement for exceeding, that was a whole other goal to assess lots of children against, and it became a lot of work. So that's been taken out. But I think that the second thing it's worth saying about the exceeding level is that this really marks an important turn in the road, which is to say that what we want children to have are high quality foundational experiences in their early years, deep and secure learning, enjoyment, all of those positive attitudes to their learning. And that's not necessarily achieved by pushing children who are learning things more quickly onto new content all of the time so that they become exceeding. The research into early learning would suggest that it's actually better to give those children more time to get really secure, to have really rich experiences and repeated experiences, to have maybe real world problems, see things from different points of view. Very similar to what's sometimes called the mastery approach to maths teaching in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. There's also no more requirement for external moderation of the EYFS, but of course that doesn't mean that it isn't important for schools to have moderation systems to check that these assessments are accurate. As has already been said, there's a bit more detail in the educational programs now. There's also a specific requirement to promote oral health, which is really important for us where I'm speaking from, because we have real problems with children's oral health. We have lots of children with tooth decay. We know that disadvantaged children are more likely to have poor oral health. It's painful for small children to have untreated cavities. It can affect their speech and language development. So for me, that's a really welcome addition. What's new in the updated 2021 development matters? I think the first thing to say is that it's a lot briefer than its predecessor. It's about 2/3 of the length. It's also written in more accessible language, and that means that you can read it in about an hour and a half. One of the interesting things when we talk to practitioners about the 2012 development matters is very few people had read it from beginning to end and got that big picture that Phil was talking about earlier. So we'd encourage you to read it. It's 90 minutes, either find 90 minutes, and I know life is busy, or maybe split it down into smaller blocks of time, but just to get a sense of what the document is saying and what that big picture is. Although it's shorter overall, there's actually more focus on children's early communication. So that section is now longer. We work closely with ICANN, the Children's Communication Charity, to get that right. The reason is that it's increasingly clear that children's thinking, their learning, their social development, all sit on the bedrock of their early communication. We know that how well a child communicates at 5 is one of the best predictors we've got about how well they'll be doing in school at 11. Yet we also hear from practitioners of significant concerns about children's communication. So there's more focus there. Second, reducing workload. So if I can pick up those DFE themes, it's just making sure we stop and think before we do something is this going to be useful? Is this the best thing I can spend my time doing? And again, it was interesting talking to practitioners that for many of us, it wasn't so much the workload, it was more the sense we were putting a lot of effort into things that didn't make a positive difference to children that was the problem. There's specific guidance for the reception year in the new document, which was asked for in a DfE consultation on assessment. And number 4, which is what I'm going to focus on next, is a renewed emphasis on narrowing the gap. Before I do move on to that section on narrowing the gap, let me just highlight something that I think is important to consider, which is that as we're all thinking really hard about helping all of our children to bounce back from the pandemic, these are really key themes for all of us. So we know, for example, that where children haven't experienced the normal range of early years provision, or may not have been to any children's centre or other stay and play groups, maybe they haven't been in nursery or with their childminder, it's their communication that is most likely to have been affected. We know that the poorest families have almost certainly been hit the hardest by the pandemic. So therefore, the focus on narrowing the gap in equality is exactly where we should be. So Becky Francis, who's Chief Executive Officer of the Education Endowment Foundation, I think puts the challenge to us really well, which is that once children fall behind, it's hard for them to catch up, and they are likely to fall further behind throughout school. And here Becky isn't talking about COVID-19 and the pandemic. She's talking about what we see year after year in our system, which is that there's a very strong link in the English early years and school system between how well off your family is and how well you're doing by the end of the EYFS, or by the end of Key Stage 2, or at your GCSEs. But there's really good evidence, for example, from the large EPSI project, that high quality early years provision can make a big difference to children. High quality early is good for all children, but it's especially good for children who face those sorts of early disadvantage. And there isn't another part of the school sector that's as good as EYFS at making that positive difference, which is why I have committed the last 25 years or so of my working life to being here in the early years, because this is the space where we can make a difference. There's very little evidence of a similar impact later on when children are older. And that's the key point Becky Francis is making here. So if we go back to 2013, the first year that we had results for the profile at the end of the EYFS of the current statutory framework, you'll see that there is a gap between children who are eligible for free school meals at that bottom line and all other children at that top line. And you'll see that as you scroll through 2014, 2015, 2016, 17, 18, that even though the outcomes as measured by the profile improve, the gap remains roughly the same. And then in 2019, the gap actually widened for the first time in some years. Everything that I'm hearing at the moment is telling me that that challenge may well be even greater as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've had a persistent problem for many years. It started to get a bit worse, and it's probably quite a bit worse than that now. We also know that if we look at specific cohorts of children, that there are whole groups of children in our system who, on average, don't do as well as the average child. So I know that at individual level, there's a lot of diversity. So we all know those families who are whose children receive free school meals, but the family, the early years setting, the reception team do a fantastic job together, and that child really excels. And the same with children from these different cohorts. But if we just zoom back, the overall picture should worry us. So at the top of that table, we can see that the disadvantages are really stark for Gypsy and Roma children, for Traveller of Irish Heritage children. We really haven't done well by either of those two groups of children for many years. Let's look at some of the other groups of children who aren't doing as well as we'd like them to be. Pakistani children, children from Black Caribbean backgrounds, children from other Black backgrounds and other ethnic groups. There's a lot of children who aren't doing as well as we'd like them to be doing by the end of the EYFS. That has to be a call to action for all of us. So, of course, the next question is, what is it about Development Matters and the changes to the EYFS that's intended to address some of these issues? So when you look at the new Development Matters, one of the first things you'll notice is that at the beginning, there's a summary of 7 features of effective practice. That summary is there as a guide to the sort of professional development and team development we should all be focusing on to have the most impact on how well children do. And remember, high quality early years is good for everyone, but it's especially good for disadvantaged children. So by continuously focusing on improving quality, we're also making that big difference for disadvantaged children. So the first area of those 7 features I'm going to focus on is pedagogy. And the pedagogy section in the updated Development Matters is really an evolution from where we were in 2012. It's very similar. So it focuses on the different dimensions of pedagogy, or how we help children to learn. So we know that that's partly about the enabling environment, the equipment that we carefully select, the way we store and present that to the children, the way that we make changes in response to children's interests or to bring in new challenge. That is a really significant part of early years pedagogy. In the foreground, there's what we're doing minute by minute, and that is hugely important. Those moments when we decide to stand back so that we encourage children's independent play and exploration and we don't interfere with it. Those moments when we know it's best to get stuck in and join in with a child's play. The times when we know it's important to offer an adult-guided playful learning experience to help the children develop or practice something new. The times when it's important directly to teach children something, all the way from, say, the 2-year-old who really wants to stick something on their collage but isn't sure how to twist the glue stick and get the glue to work, to phonics in reception, for example. So those choices are really important. One of the most important things we can do is give time to children, listen to children, have conversations with them. And those back and forth conversations, extended over several terms, make a really big difference to children's early communication. Yet often we're so busy doing other things that we lose our focus on that cornerstone of effective early years practice. And one of the key benefits that early adopters told us about, with the reduced burden on evidence gathering and data collection, was that they quite simply had more time to have conversations with children and to play with them. And they noticed that that had a really positive effect on the children's learning and development. So we know that our pedagogy has to be flexible and we have that repertoire of different approaches. Play is central to early learning. There's absolutely no question about that. All the way through the EYFS, we know that play is enjoyable. It's how children develop their thinking and their communication. It's how children make friends with each other, which is such an important part of the early years. Learn to share, learn to manage not getting what you want straight away, find ways of compromising. All of these things happen through play, and all of that imaginative stuff that provides the basis of so much later thinking happens in its early days in the play that we all support and foster. So play is absolutely central to children's early learning, as also are the characteristics of effective teaching and learning. So we know that when the children come and join us, that they are really powerful learners. Young children are described by the psychologist Alison Gopnik as the most powerful learning machines in the universe. But what we do can help them become even more powerful learners. All that help we offer to children so that they explore materials independently, make their own decisions, that encouragement we give so that children bounce back when something goes a bit wrong. All of those things make children more powerful learners, and they're all really important. And finally, there has to be a balance between child-led and adult-guided learning. And that's true across the whole of the early years. So if you're working in a baby room or a baby as a childminder, you'll know that the majority of your time, you're responding to the baby's care needs, you're responding to the baby's exploration in using all their senses of all of the things around them. And that's absolutely right. But there are points of the day when some of the baby's experience is adult guided. So for example, if you have treasure basket play, you will decide when that's offered to the baby and what you put in the treasure basket for them to explore. You might initiate a game of Peeper. You might decide which rhyme or song it would be really good idea to sing at a particular time. So there's always that balance. But as children get older, there should be more of that adult guided learning. And that's one of the key findings of the EPSI research project. That is particularly important in the reception year. And from the beginning to the end of the reception year, that balance should shift. So we would see more adult guided learning by the end of the reception year than we saw at the beginning. But there is still always, all throughout this phase, an important role for what children choose to do for their independent play and learning, which is so central to the EYFS. What is more different in Development Matters is the new focus on curriculum. And I think Phil Minns gave us some really good ways into thinking about this. So what I mean there by the top level view is what we all need to think about in school early years provision, in settings as childminders, is what are the key things that we want children to experience, to learn, to be able to do whilst they're with us. We know the group of children we're working with better than anyone else, and that gives us a strong insight into the answer to that question, which should say something brief and accessible that all of our teams and parents can understand. So we're not talking about lengthy curriculum progression documents, we're talking about a brief top-level view, and it will vary from place to place. So here in this corner of East London, lots of our children live in noisy and cramped housing, and that has a negative impact on their language development and on their physical development. So our curriculum strongly focuses on those two aspects. But if I was a few miles further east from here, where on average children have larger houses with gardens, more play opportunities, I would have a different focus. One of the reasons that Development Matters is shorter is to make more space for all of us to make the professional judgment and decisions about what's right for our children. As I said earlier, we must tackle unnecessary workload. So it is important that the focus on curriculum doesn't create a whole lot of new work, and that people are proportionate and sensible about this change. We also know that it's a balanced approach to early years that is most effective. So in other words, large amounts of children's time, quite appropriately, should be spent in their self-chosen play and exploration and activity. But we've got to be balanced about it. We've also got to have that big picture of what we want children to experience, to know, to be able to do, so that we're making sure that children aren't missing out on important things during their time with us. And I'm going to talk in the next section, after I've spoken about assessment, about that key value around inclusion and making sure that every child can thrive in our early years provision. So Iram Siraj in 2004, I think, put this really well. She said that an effective curriculum framework supports practitioners to think clearly about pedagogical aims. What are the key things we want children to know, experience, to be able to do? What are our big aims for every child? It ensures that practitioners are mindful of children's progression, and it focuses our attention and observation on the most important aspects of children's development. So when we are taking that important time to observe children's learning, we are focused on the most important aspects of their development. That means we make the best use of the time we have available. Some of the biggest questions about the updated EYFS and the things that were the biggest struggles for the early adopters were around assessment and tracking. So I'm really just going to give a few of the headlines that those early adopters found useful. Focus on what's useful. So before you start a schedule of observation and assessment and uploading it onto a tracker and analysing it, think about what is it that you want to know and need to know, and what would be the most straightforward ways of getting that information. So let's think about establishing children's starting points when they first join a reception class, which was the discussion with the early adopters. But this, I think, would be true across the EYFS. What is it we most need to know? So I would say that what we most need to know are things like the child's confidence to make a new relationship with their key person, to move from parent to key person or parent to childminder, to make relationships with other children, how well the child, relative to their age, can communicate what they want and what they need. I'd want to know a bit about their small and large motor development. Can they play and take part in lots of the experiences I'm offering with the equipment, or are they struggling with that? I would want to know something about their self-help skills too. Dressing, undressing, using the toilet, eating. Why do I want to know those things? Because most of the children, if we've got the provision right, the key person approach right, if we are giving children that stimulating experience every day, most of the children, with some ups and downs, are going to settle well, and they're going to be accessing the learning on offer, the curriculum. But some children won't. They'll be struggling in some of those areas I talked about earlier. So we need to focus a lot of effort to help those children to overcome those early struggles, so that as soon as possible, they're making friends, they're taking part, they're engaged in the learning on offer. So that's what I mean by a focus on what's useful, rather than saying we need this amount of data that's going to provide evidence of children's starting points and evidence of their progress. Because once we start talking in those terms, we're making assessment and data our central preoccupation, not supporting the children, not helping their learning. We need to have the right tools for the job. So again, for most children, the top level view of our curriculum and looking at how well children are making progress towards the things that we think are important, checking their progress in the prime areas, that's going to be perfectly sufficient. But if a child is struggling with their learning, it may not be sufficient. We might need to use a more detailed assessment system. if a child, for example, is struggling with their early communication, we might need to think about using the DFE-funded tool Universally Speaking, which you can download free online, so we can look in more detail at the difficulty they're having. And earlier I put in a link to the chat for the EYFS Early Years Measures database, which helps us find the best tools to find out exactly where a child might be struggling with their learning. Where we're observing and assessing children's learning, the children's voices and reflections should be central. So it's much better to do less of that sort of assessment, but involve the children in reflecting and talking about their learning and development, than to do lots and lots of photos and observations that the children aren't part of and play no role in the children's thinking or development. Because just taking a picture of something a child's done on an iPad and uploading it onto a tracker makes zero difference to a child's learning and experience. Parents too must be included in high quality assessment work. And just to reiterate that message, it's vital that we're inclusive and that every child can thrive. So when we reduce the focus we've got on data and evidence, we have more time to do what will actually make a big difference to children's learning, which is to offer them feedback. Some of the best evidence we've got about feedback, again, comes from the EPSI project, which talks about sustained shared thinking, where an adult and a child, or maybe a small group of children, and occasionally child to child, explore a concept or a problem or an idea through dialogue, through talking together, through those conversations that adults sometimes kick off by saying, like, but I wonder why that's happening. Why is it that when you jump up and down, the lights start shining on your welly boots? Those episodes of sustained shared thinking are rare, but also really powerful for children. And they're a good example of giving feedback to a child, of responding to what they say and commenting on it and getting the child just to think about something from perhaps a slightly different point of view. But I'm also going to share a short excerpt from a video, which is called Austin's Butterfly. Now, this video has got some kindergarten children from America in it, but also some slightly older ones. So it's not bang on for early years, but there's a lot that is really valuable in this video for us to reflect on and to think about how we could offer this sort of feedback to our children aged in the early years foundation stage in England. So here's Austin's Butterfly. And you can see the whole of this video for free on YouTube.
This is a story called Austin's Butterfly. And it's a true story about a first grade boy, and his name is Austin, and he goes to school, or used to go to school, in a town called Boise, Idaho. And in his class in Boise, Idaho, they were studying butterflies, and he had to do a project. His job in first grade was to draw a butterfly, and this is the butterfly that he picked. Austin had to use this photograph as his model, and he had to draw an accurate scientific drawing of this butterfly. This is called a tiger swallowtail.
I knew it!
Can you tell, Toby, why it's called tiger?
Because it kind of has the stripes of the tiger right there.
Good. So here was Austin's job. He was supposed to do a scientific drawing of that butterfly. But remember, Austin was only in first grade. And you know what he did? He forgot to look like a scientist carefully. He got his paper and he just started to draw the image of a butterfly that he had in his head. And he wasn't looking like a scientist, and so this is what he drew.
Whoa.
It's not bad, and it is a butterfly, but does it look exactly like this?
No.
No, it doesn't yet. It doesn't look exactly like this yet. Luckily, this wasn't a regular school where Austin went. It was an expeditionary learning school, just like Przemysl School. And so they didn't look at this and say, good, Austin, you're done. They said, Austin, good start. Now we can start giving you critique so you can do a second draft and make it better, and a third draft and make it better, and you can make it much, much closer to this. And he was ready to go. All of the first graders in his critique group sat on the floor like you guys are, and they decided to split their advice into two kinds. First, just the shape of the wings. And then when the shape was right, they'd give him advice about the pattern inside the wings. Alia, what would you say?
You can make it much pointier.
Good. These wings could be much pointier. Who else would add something? Atak, what would you say?
How about the angle? Because, not to be mean about
Yes.
the angle, it's just not exact, so...
Okay, so show me. Come on up here, Atak. Show me what you would ask him to do slightly differently.
like to make it a little longer,
Longer where? Draw where you would do it.
right there.
Okay, so pull this out longer.
Yeah.
That's very specific, Atak. Thank you. Jamila, what would you say?
It's like triangle.
Good. Jamila, I love that. So you're saying more like a triangle shape. And I agree. Well, you know what? Those first graders came up with most of those same ideas. And you know what Austin said? He said, okay, I'll go try. And he went back to his seat and he drew this.
Wow.
But the key thing that I would just leave us all to reflect on is that all of that work we do with children at different ages in the EYFS, where we notice and give them feedback on what they're doing, that can be really powerful to help them become more powerful learners. And it's much more effective than endless amounts of recording and evidence building. This is the space where we can make a difference for children. But some of the evidence is telling us that although we're good at identifying which children are struggling in the early years, we're not always so good at identifying the causes of children's failure to progress. So again, if I go back to the EPSI project found that when children are seen to be struggling, we tend not to focus their attention on helping them to take part in the main curriculum we have on offer. We tend to give them different things to do, which might keep them happy and occupied, and which might have value in themselves. But if children are missing out on core early learning experiences, that's not going to pan out well for them either by the end of the early years or as they move on through school. And one of the different ways I think of thinking about this is that instead of having that focus on what I would call differentiating down, so giving children who are struggling with their learning easier things to do, let's think about scaffolding up. So if we want children to do something that's very difficult for them, we give them the help that they need to make at least some of the steps of progress that it's important for them to do. So one of the examples I've given a few times about this is our curricular aim here in this nursery for all of our 3 and 4-year-olds independently to bake a bread roll following a recipe card. That's challenging for all of our children, but it can be especially challenging for some of our children with SEND. So how we think about it is, how do we scaffold up for those children? So for example, if you think about a 3-year-old with an autism spectrum condition, they may find it really challenging to mix and touch that wet dough. They might need a lot of help to do that. So the scaffolding up, if you look at the diagram here, we might first of all do it for the child. Then we might offer some help, do most of it for them, but get them just to experience poking their finger in and maybe just doing a couple of presses, those first stages of kneading. We would be modeling, showing the child how to do it, giving them that repeated modeling so they can see what to do. We'd be working very closely with the child's parents. And for some of our children, they will make those small steps of progress, and it's really significant for them, and we celebrate that. But it also means they're part of the same mainstream curriculum that everyone else is accessing. But even better than that is that what we find is that many children with ASCs, once with a lot of support from us and their parents, they start to manage the difficulties of those tactile experiences. They're actually really good at following those recipe cards. And many of them actually excel and do way better than we expected them to do. So that's why our focus is on scaffolding up and not on differentiating down. So for me, inclusive practice is about getting to know the children really well, celebrating what they can do and building on that, but also identifying precisely what their barriers to learning are and helping children to overcome those barriers. So again, if we go back to a child with an ASC who's 3 years old, traditionally we might have assessed their language in the birth to 11-month band, but actually that's not a precise assessment because that child's language development is not at all like the development of a baby from birth to 11 months. It's like the communication of a 3-year-old with an ASC, and each child with an ASC will be unique and individual, and we need to find out what they can communicate so we can build on that, and where they struggle to communicate so we can help them over those barriers, for example, using something like a core communication board. We also need to remember that most special needs are temporary, and that if we give children the right support quickly, most of them can overcome those needs. Early identification is key, because once children start to struggle in the early years, they quickly become demoralised, and we need to have that commitment to continuous improvement. So local authorities have quality schemes, there's the inclusion quality mark, there are tools like the inclusive classroom profile. So I'm going to just show a brief bit of video, and this is from Laurence, who's a young man who I actually worked with in nursery when he was 2 and 3 and 4. And here Laurence tells some of his story.
Hi, I'm Laurence, I'm 25, currently live in Leeds, West Yorkshire, also known as God's own country. And I'm going to give a little bit of insight into the initial drive behind the support that I was given before starting primary school and how this support continued throughout my primary school years. So I started out as a very young boy in North London in Haringey, and the early signs were that I was anything but a normal child. The signs that I was quite different, and I was also showing signs of having a learning difficulty, namely Asperger's syndrome, a syndrome I'm very proud to say that I have, but of course was not going to know that I had that at the tender age of 3 years old when I joined Woodlands Park Nursery, which Julian was running at the time. So Julian picked up on this straight away. While the other kids were all kind of together in their groups, playing together, doing their thing, I couldn't handle or didn't want the social interaction at the time. I wanted my own routine, a strict one I needed to stick to, and that routine was to be by myself and to throw my shoes over the wall into the retirement home next to the nursery. Sometimes got the shoes back. One point I didn't, much to my parents' dismay. As well as this, I was obsessed with the Harry McClary books that were at the nursery, and I needed to read them every single time I was there. The same exact books, every time I was there. Julian supported me and allowed me to do this by making me read the books onto a voice recorder. That's so all the other kids would have access to the books in audio form, which would allow me to fulfill that routine I needed to stick to. So while this support was given to me at the nursery, I wasn't going to be at the nursery forever, and Julian knew this, of course, and he knew that and could see that I needed the support to continue when I was in school. So Julian fought tooth and nail and really pushed for me to have that extra support when I started school, and thanks to this, by the time I started primary school, the support was already in place. This support at primary school came in the form of 2 support workers called Mr. Artemis and Mrs. Nightingale. Their primary role in my classes was to basically ensure that I fully understood what was going on around me and that I fully knew what I was doing with regards to what we were learning and the tasks that we had to do, and that I wasn't just sitting there lost and confused and not doing anything or getting involved, basically. As well as this, they were also there to ensure that I actually engaged with my classmates and tried to speak to them and make friends, because as an extremely shy, introverted primary school child with Asperger's syndrome, this wasn't going to be done of my own accord. I would have been needed to be pushed to do this, and they obviously knew how crucial it would be for me going forward. few years into primary school then, and my dad gets a job up in Leicester. So we all up and move. We leave North London and we move to a small village just outside Leicester, where I started a complete new school. As a child, that would completely flip out if my brother got to go on my PlayStation before me, which was different than normal. Moving from London to a complete different part of the country was a massive move, and my teacher, an Irish guy called Mr. Quinn, he completely understood this, and he ensured the levels of support that I received continued through so many extra efforts, such as telling me whenever there was a change in routine, something as small as we're doing English first and not maths. He would let me know before so it wouldn't be a shock when he announced it. He also let me choose to work with my mate Joe, who I was most comfortable with in that classroom, in any group work tasks. And as well as that, at one point I remember there was this nativity play where all the parents were coming to watch, and he knew there was no way in this world I was ever going to go on stage and learn lines. So he let me and my mate Joe dress up in boiler suits, and we were the prop guys. Basically, we were walking around the school carrying chairs and tables and setting everything up. Something so small, but which would have been so important for me. In secondary school, I had some support. I had extra time in exams, which I of course used, and there was also a dedicated learning support unit where if I needed chat or any assistance or something was up, anything like that, I could go and speak to them and they would help. But in secondary school, I didn't use or need this support as well. I also didn't need any one-on-one support as I previously did, because I was becoming more and more confident, more and more sociable, a lot less shy. I was making established friendship groups and doing so many things outside of my comfort zone or just completely different, and not being fazed by that. I put this down to the initial support that I was given in primary school, acting as a foundation and building a platform for me to go on and overcome the barriers with my Asperger's syndrome and actually go on and succeed in school and do some really good things. I sit here and I feel really blessed. I have a first degree in sociology at the University of Leeds with a study abroad to Germany in there to boot, which was just the best year ever. What I'd give to go back, and I'm extremely confident. I'm not faced by social situations, don't care about change anymore. In fact, bring it on. My next goal is to move to Asia to teach English to kids. Want the opportunity to travel, and I also want to show the same faith in kids that was shown in me, and hopefully give the same platform to another kid that was given to me. Thank you.
So there's no way in the world, knowing Laurence when I did, that I would have imagined that would be his life story. And I'm quite prepared to be humble about that. And I'm so delighted for him. And what it tells us is that just because we've got that 2 or 3 or 4-year-old who's really struggling with us in the early years, doesn't mean that they're not going to do brilliantly. We must give them the right support they need at the time and the right support for their transition, and have really high expectations for all of our children. But sadly, the fact is that children with SEND are 10 to 15 months behind other children by the end of the EYFS. They're only 5, but they're 10 to 15 months behind. And that's a problem we've really got to tackle, because we want many more Laurences to thrive in our early years and school system. So what are my key points for reflection to leave you all with? Number 1 is target our efforts on helping those children who are struggling to access the curriculum. First of all, focus on ensuring that you have consistent high quality for every child. And second, focus assessment effort, focus planning effort on the children who most need help to overcome their struggles to access the curriculum. And that curriculum must be inclusive, and it must enable every child to make progress. My final call to action for everyone, as you look at the revised EYFS, build on your strengths. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Look at what you do really well and protect that. Look at the revised EYFS, put a sensible plan into place that's realistic, that means that during the year, you're going to meet all of those new requirements. Make sure that we don't look at September as some moment where we change everything we do, but build on our strengths. And absolute final point is that I've expanded on a lot of these themes in a free book, which I've written, which you can download. So if that's helpful for you to have some more guidance, please feel free to download that document. And thank you very much, everyone.